When tech billionaire Marcus Stone publicly humiliates a homeless veteran over a minor coffee spill, he thinks nothing of it. After all, people like that are invisible to men like him. But hours later, Marcus is shocked to discover that same homeless man sitting in his boardroom as Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, a decorated military officer and key consultant for a $500 million defense contract. As Marcus's perfectly ordered world begins to unravel, he becomes obsessed with uncovering the truth. How can a respected military expert also be living on the streets? The answer will challenge everything Marcus believes about success, failure, and the masks we all wear, revealing a truth more surprising than he could have ever imagined. Marcus Stone's alarm beeped at exactly 5:30 a.m. He didn't hit snooze. Men who ran billion-dollar companies never hit snooze. He stepped onto his balcony in silk pajamas, looking out at the city below. From the 30th floor of his penthouse, everyone looked tiny, just how he liked it. Another perfect day to make money, he said to himself, sipping his morning coffee. At 45, Marcus had everything a man could want. His company, Stone Innovations, made the chips inside nearly every smart device in America. What started in his college dorm room now filled a gleaming tower downtown with his name on it. Marcus showered in his marble bathroom bigger than most people's living rooms. He chose a blue suit that cost more than some cars and slipped on shoes made by a man in Italy who only made 10 pairs a year. His phone buzzed. The stock market had opened, and Stone Innovations was up another 2 points. Not bad for a Tuesday, he smiled, admiring his reflection. His hair was still dark, with just enough gray at the temples to look wise but not old. He worked out every morning with his personal trainer to keep his body as sharp as his mind. The elevator took him straight to his private garage, where 5 luxury cars waited. Today felt like a Ferrari day. The engine roared to life, and Marcus felt that familiar rush. He had earned this, all of it. As he drove through the city streets, Marcus barely noticed the world outside his Italian sports car. His mind was already in the boardroom, planning his next big move. The car's navigation system warned of traffic ahead due to an accident. "Find alternate route," Marcus commanded, annoyed at the delay. Time was money, and Marcus Stone's time was worth more than most. The detour took him through a part of town he usually avoided. Old buildings with peeling paint, people waiting at bus stops, a group of homeless people huddled near a steam vent for warmth. "Get a job," Marcus muttered as he drove past. He truly believed anyone could succeed if they just worked hard enough. After all, he had started with nothing but a good idea and determination. His father had worked in a factory his whole life, coming home with calloused hands and a tired back. Marcus had promised himself a different life. He'd worked his way through college, sleeping only 4 hours a night while coding his first programs. Now he employed over 5,000 people. He paid his taxes. He even donated to charity at the big gala each Christmas. What more could society ask of him? Marcus pulled into his reserved parking space closest to the elevator. The sign read, "Reserved for Marcus Stone, CEO and founder." He liked seeing those words every morning. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," said the security guard. Marcus nodded without really looking at the man. Was his name Tom? Tim? It didn't matter. In the elevator, he straightened his tie and checked his messages. 17 new emails since he left home 20 minutes ago. The doors opened directly into his office suite. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," his assistant Angela said, handing him a steaming cup of coffee, exactly how he liked it. The Tokyo team sent over the new prototype designs, and the board meeting has been moved to 11 instead of 10. "Fine," he said, taking the coffee without looking up from his phone. Tell Tokyo I want the battery life improved before production. And make sure everyone knows I won't tolerate lateness at the board meeting, even if it was rescheduled. Chaturi's office was larger than most apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the entire city. Awards and magazine covers featuring his face lined one wall. The opposite wall held a single picture: Marcus shaking hands with the president after winning Entrepreneur of the Year. Marcus settled into his custom leather chair and swiveled to face his 3 computer monitors. Numbers, graphs, and reports filled the screens. This was his world. This was what mattered. He pressed the intercom. "Angela, hold all calls unless it's Tokyo or the board. I need to focus." With a few clicks, he moved millions of dollars around the globe. Power hummed through his fingertips. Out there, beyond his windows, thousands of people would be affected by decisions he made before lunch. Jobs created or lost. Products built or canceled. Marcus Stone had everything a man could want: money, power, respect. What he didn't have was time for anyone who hadn't earned their place in the world. And he certainly didn't have time to wonder about the people he had driven past. This morning, huddled against the cold. They had made their choices. He had made his. And his choices had made him the man who has everything. The morning chill cut through James Washington's layers like they weren't even there. At 50 years old, his body felt every bit of the cold, especially where old wounds reminded him of another life. "Going to be a beautiful day," James said to no one in particular, his breath making little clouds in the air. He sat on a piece of cardboard that kept the worst of the sidewalk's coldness away. His spot was carefully chosen, close enough to the office buildings to catch people during their morning rush, but not so close that security would hassle him. James adjusted his faded green military jacket. The patches, 82nd Airborne Division, Combat Action Badge, and others were still neatly sewn on, though the jacket itself had seen better days. Like him. "Morning, Mr. Jackson," James called to the newsstand owner who was setting up for the day. "Morning, James. Gonna be a cold one," Mr. Jackson replied, sliding a paper cup of coffee toward him. "On the house." "Much appreciated," James said, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm cup. Small kindnesses like this kept him going. James hadn't always lived on the streets. 3 years ago, he had an apartment, a job, and something close to a normal life. But things happen. Bad things. The kind that take everything away piece by piece until you're sitting on cardboard watching people in expensive clothes hurry past. His eyes were still sharp enough to notice details most people missed. The security guard who slipped half his lunch to the stray cat behind the building. The young secretary who cried in her car before putting on a brave face for work. The businessman who seemed to have everything but looked hollow inside. James arranged his few possessions neatly beside him. An old backpack contained everything he owned: a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a worn paperback book, and his most treasured possession, a small photo album with plastic-protected pictures of better times. His metal cup sat in front of him, but James never asked for money directly. It felt too much like begging. Instead, he offered a smile and a good morning to anyone who made eye contact. Some dropped coins or even bills. Most pretended not to see him. I don't blame them, James thought. Before Afghanistan, I might have done the same. A woman in a nurse's uniform stopped and handed him a banana and a granola bar. "Protein's important, especially in this weather," she said with a kind smile. "Thank you, ma'am." "God bless," James replied, meaning it. Her small act of kindness would get him through the morning. Around 8:30, the real rush began. men and women, in business suits streamed toward the glass towers, carrying coffee cups and looking at phones. James recognized the regulars. Some nodded hello. Most didn't. Then came the man in the blue suit, driving a red Ferrari that growled like an angry animal. James had seen him many times. He was always in a hurry, never looking left or right. The gold watch on his wrist probably cost more than James had seen in the past year. James didn't resent him. Everyone had their own path. When the morning crowd thinned out, James counted his money. $4.37. Enough for a sandwich later. He tucked the coins carefully into a zippered pocket inside his jacket. The rest of his morning followed a familiar routine. At 10, sirs, he packed up and walked 12 blocks to the Veterans Center. There, he could take a shower, use a real bathroom, and check the job board. "Morning, James," said Ruth, the older volunteer who ran the place. "Coffee's fresh." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, taking off his cap as he stepped inside. The center was nothing fancy, just a converted storefront with mismatched furniture, but it was warm and safe. James helped stack chairs and sweep floors to earn his keep. "Any luck with that maintenance job at the mall?" Ruth asked. James shook his head. "They went with someone younger." Ruth patted his shoulder. "Their loss. You're the most reliable man I know." After a shower and a change into his second set of clothes, James felt almost human again. He checked his phone, a basic model that Ruth had helped him get through a Veterans Assistance Program. The battery was at 30%. He'd need to find a place to charge it later. At noon, James headed to the library. There, he could sit in a real chair, read the newspapers, and use the computer for an hour to search for jobs and check his email. Ms. Peterson, the librarian, nodded as he entered. "Your usual computer is open, Mr. Washington." "Thank you, ma'am," he said. She was another kind soul who never made him feel less than anyone else. James typed carefully, 2 fingers at a time, updating his resume and checking for work. 25 years in the Army had given him skills, but civilian employers wanted different things. And when they saw his age, or worse, his current address at the shelter, the interviews rarely came. By 2 p.m., James was back on his corner, cup in front of him. The afternoon crowd was different. Tourists, shoppers, people with time to notice him. Sometimes that was good, sometimes not. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing. One pointed at him and whispered something that made the others laugh harder. James kept his eyes down. He'd learned not to engage when people were cruel. The cold was getting worse as the sun began to set. James checked his watch, a simple Timex, one of the few things he'd kept from before. Almost 5. The evening rush would start soon, and then he'd head to the shelter if there were beds available. A businessman walked past, then stopped and turned back. He dropped a $5 bill in James's cup without meeting his eyes. "Thank you, sir." "God bless," James said. The man nodded awkwardly and hurried away. That night at the shelter, James claimed a lower bunk near the wall. He carefully placed his backpack between himself and the wall. Safer that way. As he lay down, his body ached from sitting on concrete all day. Under his pillow, his hand found the small photo album. He didn't need to open it. The faces were memorized. His wife Sarah before the cancer took her. His old Army buddies. The house they once owned. Just temporary, he whispered to himself. The same thing he'd said for 3 years now. This is just temporary. James Washington had nothing, according to most people who passed him on the street. No home, no car, no fancy clothes. But as he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the kindness of Mr. Jackson's coffee, Ruth's patient help, and Ms. Peterson's respect. Maybe he wasn't as poor as people thought. Monday morning arrived with a cold, steady rain that soaked the city. James woke before dawn in the shelter, his internal clock still set to military time after all these years. He gathered his few belongings quietly, trying not to wake the other men. "Heading out already?" whispered the night attendant. James nodded. Best to get a head start. Outside, the rain came down in sheets. James pulled his military jacket tighter, knowing it wouldn't keep him dry for long. The jacket was waterproof once, but years of wear had worn away its protection. Still, it was better than nothing. By 6:30 a.m., James was soaked through. His usual spot would be pointless today. Nobody dropped money in a cup during a downpour. He needed somewhere dry, at least for a little while. 2 blocks away stood West Side. Coffee, an upscale shop where business people paid $6 for fancy coffees with Italian names. James rarely went there. The looks he got from customers made him uncomfortable. But today, the warm light from its windows was too inviting to resist. He counted the change in his pocket. $3.27. Enough for a small coffee and a brief escape from the rain. Just an hour to warm up, he promised himself, pushing open the heavy glass door. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the rich smell of coffee. The shop was crowded with morning customers, most staring at phones or laptops. A few glanced up as he entered, their expressions changing when they saw his wet clothes and worn backpack. James took his place at the end of the line, keeping his eyes down. Water dripped from his jacket onto the polished floor. "Can I help you?" asked the young barista when it was his turn. "Small coffee, please." "Regular," James said, carefully counting out his change. "Room for cream?" she asked, her smile professional but kind. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." James moved to the pickup area, trying to take up as little space as possible. That's when he noticed the man in the blue suit, the same one he often saw, driving the red Ferrari. Today he was talking loudly on his phone while tapping impatiently on the counter. "I don't care what the engineers say. We promised the board a working prototype by Friday. And that's what we'll deliver," the man said into his phone. James recognized that tone from his army days, an officer used to giving orders and having them obeyed. The man's expensive watch caught the light as he gestured emphatically. "Order for Marcus," called another barista, placing a large cup on the counter. The man in the blue suit, Marcus, grabbed his drink without acknowledging the barista. He turned quickly, still focused on his phone conversation, and bumped directly into James. Time seemed to slow down. James watched as coffee splashed from Marcus's cup onto the man's crisp blue suit. It wasn't much, just a few drops. But on the expensive fabric, it might as well have been a bucket. "What the?" Marcus stopped mid-sentence, looking down at his suit, then up at James. His face turned from surprise to anger in an instant. "I'm very sorry, sir," James said quickly, reaching for a napkin. "Let me help with that." Marcus stepped back as if James might contaminate him further. "Don't touch me," he snapped, loud enough that the entire coffee shop fell silent. The man ended his phone call with a quick, "I'll call you back." "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Marcus demanded, dabbing at the small stain with a napkin. "I apologize, sir. It was an accident," James said calmly, hands at his sides. "An accident? You people shouldn't even be in here." Marcus's voice grew louder. "This isn't a homeless shelter. It's a place of business for people who actually have jobs to do." The coffee shop grew uncomfortably quiet. Everyone was watching now. James felt the familiar weight of eyes judging him, assuming the worst. "I paid for my coffee just like everyone else," James said quietly, dignity in his voice. "Oh, I'm sure," Marcus sneered. "Probably with change you begged for outside. Tell me." What's your contribution to society today? Besides ruining my $3,000 suit? A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman gathered her things and left. "Sir, I'm just trying to get out of the rain," James explained, his voice steady despite his embarrassment. "There's a perfectly good bus station for that," Marcus replied coldly. "Or did you get kicked out of there too? Probably drinking, right? Or drugs?" James stood perfectly still, his face a careful mask. It was a look he'd perfected in war zones, revealing nothing, even when under attack. "That's enough," said the young barista who had taken James's order. Her name tag read Zoe. "Sir, if you have a problem, you can speak to me, not harass my customer." "Customer?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're calling them now? Next you'll have rats paying for coffee." "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice," Zoe said firmly. "Or what?" Marcus challenged. "You'll throw me out? Do you know who I am?" "Someone who's making a scene over a tiny coffee stain," came a voice from behind them. An older woman in a business suit had stepped forward. "I've watched this whole thing, and the only person being inappropriate is you." Marcus looked around, suddenly aware that the entire coffee shop was staring at him. Some people had phones, out, possibly recording. "Fine," he said coldly. "Keep serving whatever walks in off the street, but don't be surprised when your regular customers stop coming." He turned to James one last time. "Next time, stay where you belong." Marcus stormed toward the door, but not before Zoe called after him. "Sir, your replacement coffee is ready." Marcus paused, then continued out without looking back. In the awkward silence that followed, James stood motionless, his eyes on the floor. "I'm sorry about that," Zoe said, approaching him with a fresh cup. "This one's on the house." "No need, miss. I paid for mine," James said quietly. "I insist," she replied. "Some people forget their manners when they think they're important." The coffee shop gradually returned to its normal buzz of conversation, though James could still feel occasional glances his way. He took his coffee to a small table in the corner, hoping to become invisible again. As he warmed his hands around the cup, James thought about Marcus's words. They weren't new. He'd heard worse on the streets. But something about the man's absolute certainty, his quick judgment without knowing anything about James's life, struck deeper than usual. The rain continued outside, drumming against the windows. James sipped his coffee slowly, making it last. In an hour, he'd have to go back out there. For now, though, the warmth was enough. He watched as people came and went, wondering if any of them saw him as a person, not just a problem. Most didn't meet his eyes. A few did, with expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. Only Zoe treated him like anyone else, stopping by to ask if he wanted a refill. "No thank you, miss. You've been kind enough," he replied. By the time James left, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. He zipped his jacket and stepped outside, the cold air a sharp contrast to the coffee shop's warmth. The encounter with Marcus already felt like a distant memory, just another reminder of his invisibility to men like that. What James couldn't know was that across town, in a gleaming office tower, Marcus Stone was about to begin a meeting that would connect their lives in ways neither man could imagine. Marcus stormed into Stone Innovations headquarters, still fuming about the coffee shop incident. The stain on his suit jacket was barely visible, but his pride had taken a much bigger hit. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," Angela said as he passed her desk. "Is it?" he snapped. "Get me the number for West Side Coffee. I want to speak to the manager about their customer policies." Angela nodded, making a note. "Your 10 o'clock is already in the conference room." "What? 10 o'clock? I thought the board meeting was moved to 11. "The military contract meeting, sir. Colonel Johnson from the Department of Defense and her consultant arrived early. I put them in the main conference room with refreshments. Marcus stopped abruptly. "They're here already? Why wasn't I notified immediately?" "I just did, sir," Angela replied calmly, used to his moods. "And your suit jacket replacement is hanging in your office. Navy blue, just like you requested yesterday." Marcus took a deep breath. This military contract could double Stone Innovations' value overnight. The Defense Department wanted their next-generation security chips for everything from communications to weapons systems. He couldn't afford to look rattled. "Have R&D bring the prototype demonstrations," he ordered, heading to his office to change jackets. "And tell Jason from legal to join us." 5 minutes later, Marcus walked into the conference room with his most charming smile. A woman in a crisp military uniform stood looking at the city view. Colonel Sarah Johnson, according to her nameplate, mid-50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Colonel Johnson, welcome to Stone Innovations," Marcus said, extending his hand. "I apologize for keeping you waiting." "No apology needed, Mr. Stone," she replied with a firm handshake. "We were early, and your staff has been most accommodating." "Excellent. Shall we get started? I understand you're interested in our secure processing chips for—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence as the second person in the room turned around from studying the company's product display. The man wore a clean but simple button-down shirt and khaki pants. His gray-flecked beard was neatly trimmed, but Marcus would recognize those eyes anywhere. They were the same eyes that had looked at him with quiet dignity just an hour ago in the coffee shop. It was the homeless man. Here, in his conference room. "Mr. Stone, this is Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, retired," Colonel Johnson said, apparently not noticing Marcus's shock. "He's consulting with us on this project." James extended his hand. "Good to meet you officially, Mr. Stone." Marcus took the hand automatically, his mind racing. James's grip was firm, professional. Nothing like the desperate handshake he would have expected from a street person. "Lieutenant Colonel?" Marcus repeated weakly. 25 years of service," Colonel Johnson said with obvious respect. "James was one of our top cybersecurity specialists before retiring. Now he consults on sensitive projects. We're lucky to have him on this one." Marcus looked from James to Colonel Johnson, and back again. James's face revealed nothing. No hint of recognition, no acknowledgement of their earlier encounter. It was as if they were meeting for the first time. "Please, let's sit," Marcus managed to say, gesturing toward the chairs. For the next hour, Marcus struggled to focus, as Colonel Johnson outlined the Defense Department's needs. The contract would be worth over $500 million initially, with potential for billions more. Any other day, Marcus would be fully engaged, asking smart questions, showcasing his company's capabilities. Today, he could barely keep his thoughts straight. James Washington sat across from him, taking notes and occasionally asking detailed technical questions that revealed an expert understanding of security systems. Questions Marcus's own engineers sometimes struggled to answer. "Your quantum encryption approach is impressive," James noted at one point. "But have you addressed the side-channel vulnerability identified in last year's DARPA report?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "We've implemented several countermeasures," he said vaguely, before signaling his R&D director to elaborate. Throughout the meeting, Marcus kept waiting for James to say something about the coffee shop, to reveal to Colonel Johnson how Marcus had humiliated him publicly just hours earlier. The revelation would surely kill the contract on the spot, but James remained entirely professional, discussing technical specifications and security protocols, as if he'd never seen Marcus before today. When Colonel Johnson excused herself to take a call, Marcus found himself alone with James for the first time. The silence felt heavy between them. "Mr. Washington," Marcus began awkwardly, "I believe we may have—" "The Colonel will only be a few minutes," James interrupted, his voice neutral. "You might want to have your team prepare the laboratory demonstration she requested." Before Marcus could say more, the conference room door opened and Angela entered with fresh coffee. "Thank you," James said with a polite smile as she poured him a cup. "Cream or sugar, sir?" she asked. "Black is fine, thank you," he replied. Marcus watched this exchange with growing confusion. The man before him bore little resemblance to the dripping, wet, defeated-looking person from the coffee shop. This James Washington carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to command. Yet they were unmistakably the same person. The same eyes, the same voice, even the same way of saying thank you, with genuine appreciation. When Colonel Johnson returned, the meeting continued for another hour. They discussed timelines, security clearances, and facility requirements. Throughout it all, Marcus kept stealing glances at James, trying to reconcile the homeless man with this apparent defense expert. "I think we've covered the basics for today," Colonel Johnson finally said, gathering her papers. "We'll need to bring our technical team for the next meeting. How's tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow would be perfect," Marcus replied automatically. "Excellent. Lieutenant Colonel Washington will send over the security requirements for our team." Colonel Johnson stood and extended her hand. "I'm impressed with what I've seen so far, Mr. Stone. Your reputation is well-deserved." "Thank you, Colonel," Marcus said, shaking her hand. "We look forward to continuing our discussions." As they walked toward the elevator, Marcus made one last attempt to speak privately with James. "Mr. Washington, could I have a word before you leave?" "I'm afraid we're on a tight schedule," Colonel Johnson interjected. "Perhaps tomorrow?" "Of course," Marcus nodded, watching as the elevator doors closed. Back in his office, Marcus collapsed into his chair, his mind swirling with questions. He buzzed for Angela. "Get me everything you can find on Lieutenant Colonel James Washington," he ordered. "Military record, current employment, address, everything." "The consultant from the DoD meeting? Is there a problem, sir?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "I'd just like to know who I'm dealing with on contracts this size." After Angela left, Marcus stared out at the city below. Somewhere out there was the coffee shop where he'd belittled a decorated military officer in front of a room full of people. The memory made him wince. But why was a retired lieutenant colonel living on the streets? Why had James acted like they'd never met? And most importantly, would James tell Colonel Johnson about the coffee shop incident before tomorrow's meeting? For the first time in years, Marcus Stone, the man who had everything, felt completely out of control, and the feeling terrified him. Marcus paced his penthouse living room at 2 a.m., still wearing his work clothes minus the tie. Sleep was impossible. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw James Washington's face, first humiliated in the coffee shop, then professionally composed in the conference room. "It doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered, pouring himself another scotch, his third of the night. The city lights twinkled far below. Usually, the view calmed him, reminded him of all he had accomplished. Tonight, it only made him feel more isolated. Hours earlier, Angela had delivered a folder with everything she could find on Lieutenant Colonel James Washington. Marcus had been studying it obsessively ever since. Now the contents were spread across his glass coffee table, printed articles, military records, photographs. The story they told was remarkable. James Washington had served with distinction for 25 years in the Army. He'd completed multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. His specialty was cybersecurity and intelligence operations. He had a computer science degree from MIT and advanced training from the military's top technology programs. One photograph showed James in full dress uniform, chest covered with medals. Another showed him shaking hands with a former president after leading a successful operation against a major cyber terrorist group. Purple Heart, Silver Star. Marcus read aloud from the list of commendations. James had been wounded in action, saving 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush. He'd also prevented a major breach of military networks that could have compromised thousands of operatives. This was the man Marcus had mocked and humiliated. A genuine hero. But why is he homeless? Marcus asked the empty room. The most recent information was from 3 years ago, when James had retired from active duty. He had worked briefly for a defense contractor, then seemed to vanish from public records. No current address, no social media, nothing to explain why a decorated officer with valuable skills would end up on the streets. Marcus's phone buzzed with a news alert. Instinctively, he checked it. "No," he whispered, sitting down hard on his leather sofa. The local news site featured a short video, titled CEO's Coffee Shop Meltdown. Someone had recorded his confrontation with James and posted it online. The article mentioned Marcus by name, identifying him as tech billionaire and Stone Innovations CEO. It didn't name James, just called him an unidentified veteran. Already, the video had thousands of views. Marcus watched it with growing horror. The recording showed exactly what had happened, but seeing it from the outside was jarring. He looked cruel, entitled, and small-minded. James, by contrast, appeared dignified even while being publicly shamed. The comments below the video were brutal. "Another rich jerk who thinks he owns the world. This is how they treat veterans? Disgusting. Boycott Stone Innovations." Marcus closed the browser and tossed his phone aside. His company's public relations team would handle it tomorrow, but the damage was already done. The contract with the Defense Department now seemed further away than ever. If Colonel Johnson saw that video, she would certainly reconsider doing business with him. Marcus stood and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows. The night was clear, the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. Somewhere out there, was James Washington sleeping in a shelter tonight? Or was he back on the cold street? "It doesn't add up," Marcus said aloud, turning back to the documents. He found a photo of James from an Army publication dated 4 years ago. James stood proudly beside a pretty woman with kind eyes. His wife, according to the caption. They were at a military charity event. Both were smiling. James's arm was protectively around her shoulders. What had happened in the 3 years since? Where was his wife now? How did a man go from decorated officer to homeless veteran so quickly? Marcus's own father had been a factory worker. He'd often told young Marcus that most people were just 2 or 3 bad months away from disaster. As a successful businessman, Marcus had always dismissed this idea. Success was about making good choices, he believed. People who ended up homeless had only themselves to blame. Now, looking at James Washington's impressive record, those certainties began to crumble. Around 4 a.m., exhaustion finally overcame Marcus's racing thoughts. He fell asleep on the sofa, the documents still scattered around him. His dreams were troubled. He was back in the coffee shop, but this time everyone was wearing military uniforms except him. They all stared silently as he tried to explain himself. James Washington stood in the center, his chest covered with medals, saying nothing, just looking at Marcus with those steady eyes. The alarm on Marcus's phone jolted him awake at 5:30 a.m. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was or why he was fully dressed on his sofa. Then it all came flooding back. He showered and dressed in his most expensive suit. Today's follow-up meeting with Colonel Johnson and James Washington required his best self. Perhaps there was still a way to salvage both the contract and his reputation. Marcus studied his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired, despite his careful grooming. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do. The drive to the office was tense. Marcus checked news sites to see if the coffee shop video had gained more traction. It had. Several business publications had now picked up the story. Stone Innovations stock had dropped 3 points in pre-market trading. His PR director called as he pulled into his parking space. "We're getting ahead of this, Mr. Stone," she assured him. "I've prepared a statement expressing regret for the incident and announcing a new initiative to support homeless veterans." "Fine. Whatever it takes," Marcus replied, not really listening. The only opinion that mattered right now was Colonel Johnson's, and by extension, James Washington's. As Marcus rode the elevator to his office, he rehearsed what he might say if he got a moment alone with James. An apology seemed necessary, but would it be enough? Would it seem sincere, or just a desperate attempt to save the contract? The elevator doors opened, and Angela was waiting with a concerned expression. "Colonel Johnson's office called," she said without preamble. "They've postponed today's meeting until further notice." Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him. Did they say why? Only that something urgent came up. They'll be in touch to reschedule. And did they? Marcus hesitated. Did they mention seeing anything in the news this morning? "No, sir," Angela replied. "But Colonel Johnson did request a private call with you at 11 a.m. I've put it on your calendar." Marcus nodded, a heavy feeling settling in his stomach. A private call could only mean one thing. Colonel Johnson had seen the video. He walked slowly to his office, the day stretching ahead like a minefield. In just a few hours, he would learn if his moment of cruelty had cost him everything. At exactly 11 a.m., Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his phone. His assistant had cleared his schedule, and his office door was closed. When the phone rang, he flinched before answering. Marcus Stone speaking. "Mr. Stone, Colonel Sarah Johnson here." Her voice was formal, giving away nothing. "Colonel, thank you for calling. I understand your team needed to postpone today's meeting." "Yes, something came up that required Lieutenant Colonel Washington's attention." She paused. "However, we'd like to continue our discussions. Would 2 p.m. today work for you?" Marcus blinked in surprise. They still wanted to meet? "Absolutely. 2 p.m. is perfect," he said quickly. "Good. There's been a change of plans, though. We'd like you to come to our offices at the Federal Building downtown. Security will have your name." "Of course," Marcus agreed, trying to sound confident. "I look forward to it." After hanging up, Marcus slumped in his chair with relief. If they were still willing to meet, perhaps they hadn't seen the video after all. Or maybe it didn't matter, as much as he feared. Still, being summoned to their territory rather than hosting them at Stone Innovations felt significant. Marcus was used to people coming to him. At 1:30 p.m., Marcus's driver pulled up to the Federal Building. The imposing structure of concrete and glass seemed to judge him as he walked through the main entrance. Security was tight. ID checks, metal detectors, and stern-faced guards who didn't care that he was a CEO. Eventually, an escort led him to a conference room on the 12th floor. The room was plain but functional. Nothing like the sleek, designer spaces at his company. Colonel Johnson was already seated reviewing documents. She didn't stand when he entered. "Mr. Stone, Thank you for accommodating the change in venue. Wait, she gestured to a chair across from her. Please, have a seat. Lieutenant Colonel Washington will join us shortly. Marcus sat down, hyper-aware of how the chair was slightly lower than hers. A small but telling detail of power dynamics. I hope everything is all right with Mr. Washington, Marcus ventured. You mentioned something required his attention. Colonel Johnson looked up, her face unreadable. He's fine, just wrapping up another meeting. Before Marcus could say more, the door opened and James Washington entered. He wore the same simple but clean clothes as yesterday, with one addition, his faded military jacket with service patches. Sorry I'm late, James said, nodding to Colonel Johnson, then to Marcus. Not at all, the colonel replied. We were just getting started. Marcus watched as James took a seat beside Colonel Johnson. Today, the reality was impossible to ignore. This was definitely the same man he'd humiliated. In the coffee shop, now sitting across from him in a position of authority. Let's continue where we left off, Colonel Johnson said, opening a folder. Our technical team has reviewed your proposal and has some questions about implementation. For the next hour, they discussed technical specifications, security protocols, and timelines. Marcus answered questions automatically, his mind only half present. He kept waiting for someone to mention the coffee shop incident or the viral video, but it never came. When Colonel Johnson stepped out to take a call, Marcus found himself alone with James for the second time. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. Mr. Washington, Marcus began, his voice low, about yesterday morning at the coffee shop. I feel I must apologize for my behavior. James looked at him steadily, his expression neutral. Everyone has bad days. That's very generous of you, Marcus said, surprised by the simple response. But I was completely out of line. The things I said were inexcusable. James studied him for a moment. Is this about the contract? The question hit Marcus like a slap. Was it? Was he only apologizing to save the deal? No, Marcus said finally. Well, perhaps initially I was concerned about that. But seeing that video online, hearing myself, it made me realize some things about myself that I'm not proud of. James nodded slightly but said nothing. What I don't understand, Marcus continued, lowering his voice, is why you're living on the streets when you clearly have this. He gestured vaguely around the federal building. James's expression changed slightly, a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Things aren't always what they seem, Mr. Stone, he said quietly. Before Marcus could press further, Colonel Johnson returned. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes before concluding on a positive note. We'll proceed with the security clearance process for your team, Colonel Johnson said as they stood to leave. This type of project requires thorough background checks, as I'm sure you understand. Of course, Marcus agreed. My team will cooperate fully. As they walked to the elevator, Marcus made one last attempt. Lieutenant Colonel Washington, would you have time for a coffee? I'd like to continue our conversation. James exchanged a glance with Colonel Johnson before responding. I'm afraid I have other commitments this afternoon. Perhaps another time, Marcus suggested. Perhaps, James replied, non-committal. In the lobby, they parted ways. Marcus watched as James and Colonel Johnson walked in the opposite direction, talking quietly. Outside, Marcus dismissed his waiting driver. I need to walk, he told the confused man. I'll call when I need you. Marcus began walking without any clear destination. His mind was swirling with questions. James Washington was clearly respected by the military, and still actively consulting. He had access to high-security government facilities. Yet Marcus had seen him living on the streets with his own eyes. None of it made sense. Back at his office, Marcus buzzed for Angela. "I need you to find out everything you can about homelessness among veterans," he said. "Statistics, causes, support programs, everything." Angela raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Right away, sir. And see if you can find out what happened to James Washington's wife. There was a photo of them in the file you gave me, but no current information." "I'll do my best," Angela replied. "One more thing," Marcus added as she turned to leave. "Call my lawyer about setting up a foundation, something focused on veteran homelessness." "A foundation, sir?" Angela couldn't hide her surprise. "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "And find out who runs that coffee shop, Westside Coffee. I want to speak with the owner." After Angela left, Marcus walked to his window and stared out at the city. He had begun the day terrified of losing a contract. Now, that seemed almost secondary to the mystery of James Washington. Somewhere out there, a decorated war hero was possibly preparing to sleep on the streets again. The thought made Marcus deeply uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully explain. For a man who believed he understood how the world worked, who succeeded and who failed, and why, James Washington represented a puzzle that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew. And for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Stone wasn't thinking about his next business deal. He was thinking about a man he had wronged, and what that said about the person Marcus had become. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office earlier than usual. On his desk waited a thick folder. Angela had worked late gathering information about veteran homelessness as he requested. The statistics shocked him. Over 40,000 veterans were homeless on any given night in America. Many suffered from PTSD, physical disabilities, or struggled to translate their military skills to civilian jobs. The average time between military discharge and homelessness was just under 3 years. 3 years, Marcus murmured, thinking of James's timeline. It fit the pattern, but what didn't fit was James's continued connection to the military and his consulting work. If he was still working for the Defense Department, why would he be homeless? Angela knocked on his door, interrupting his thoughts. "Sir, I found something about Mrs. Washington," she said, placing a newspaper clipping on his desk. The article was from a local paper dated 2 years ago. The headline read, "Local Woman Remembered for Community Service." The story described how Sarah Washington, wife of retired Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, had died after a lengthy battle with cancer. The article mentioned her volunteer work with veterans' families and how she had continued this work even during her illness. "There's more," Angela said. "I spoke with a records clerk at County Memorial Hospital. Apparently, Mrs. Washington's cancer treatment was experimental and not covered by insurance. The clerk wouldn't give me details, but hinted that the costs were catastrophic." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the pieces starting to form a picture. Medical debt was one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in America, according to the folder on his desk. "What about the foundation idea?" he asked. "The lawyers are drawing up papers. They need to know how much initial funding you want to commit." Marcus thought for a moment. $10 million. To start. Angela couldn't hide her surprise. "Yes, sir. And Westside Coffee? The owner can meet you this afternoon at 2. After Angela left, Marcus continued reading through the materials. One report detailed how many veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life, finding it hard to navigate complex benefit systems or deal with the loss of the military. Community structure. Around noon, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He took the elevator down to his building's lobby, walked past the security desk, and headed outside to the spot where he'd often seen homeless people gathered. Today, only an older man with a gray beard sat there, holding a cardboard sign that read Vietnam Vet. Anything helps. "Excuse me," Marcus said awkwardly. "Do you know James? He usually sits here sometimes." The man looked up, suspicious. "Who's asking?" "I'm just concerned about him," Marcus replied, realizing how strange this must seem. "Haven't seen him in a couple days," the man said finally. "Sometimes he goes to the VA hospital on 3rd Street, or the Veterans Center over on Washington Avenue." Marcus thanked him and handed him $50 before walking back to his building. His driver was waiting with the car. "The Veterans Center on Washington Avenue," Marcus instructed. 20 minutes later, they pulled up in front of a modest storefront with a faded sign, Veterans Support Center. It looked nothing like the sleek nonprofit headquarters Marcus occasionally visited for charity galas. Inside, a few men and women sat in mismatched chairs. Some were reading newspapers, others talking quietly. An older woman with silver hair stood behind a desk, sorting through donated clothes. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up at Marcus in his expensive suit. "I'm looking for James Washington," Marcus said. "I heard he sometimes comes here." The woman studied him carefully. "And you are?" "Marcus Stone. I'm a business associate." Her eyebrows rose slightly at his name. "I'm Ruth," she said. "I run this place. James isn't here today." "Do you know where I might find him?" Ruth crossed her arms. "Why are you looking for him?" Marcus hesitated. "It's complicated. We're working on a project together, and there are some details we need to discuss." "A project?" Ruth looked skeptical. "With Stone Innovations?" "Yes," Marcus replied, surprised she knew his company. Ruth sighed. "Look, Mr. Stone, James helps out here sometimes. He's a good man who's been through a lot. If he's working with you, that's his business. But I'm not in the habit of telling people where to find my veterans." Marcus nodded, respecting her protectiveness. He pulled out a business card and wrote his personal cell number on the back. "If you see him, would you give him this? Tell him I'd like to talk. It's important." Ruth took the card, still looking suspicious. "Fine." As Marcus turned to leave, he noticed a donation box by the door. Without a word, he removed all the cash from his wallet, several $100s, and dropped it in. "That won't buy information, Mr. Stone," Ruth called after him. "I know," he replied. "It's just, thank you for what you do here." Back in his car, Marcus directed his driver to West Side Coffee. He had 40 minutes before his meeting with the owner. The coffee shop was busy with the afternoon crowd. Marcus recognized the young barista from before. Zoe, her name tag read. She noticed him too, her expression cooling immediately. "Just a regular coffee, please," he said when it was his turn to order. "Sure," she replied professionally, but without warmth. While waiting for his drink, Marcus noticed a jar on the counter with a handwritten sign. "Support our local veterans. All tips today. Go to Washington Avenue. Veterans Center." When Zoe handed him his coffee, Marcus put a $100 bill in the jar. She watched him, her expression softening slightly. "I was out of line the other day," Marcus said quietly. "Way out of line," Zoe nodded. "Yes, you were." "Does James come in here often?" "Sometimes," she answered carefully. "Not for a few days, though." Marcus nodded and took his coffee to a table in the corner, the same one where James had sat after their confrontation. From here, he could see the street outside, the people hurrying past, most not noticing the few homeless individuals they passed. Had he looked like those people just a few days ago? Unseeing? Uncaring? The coffee shop owner, a middle-aged woman, named Elena, joined him shortly. "Mr. Stone," she said, sitting across from him. "My manager said you wanted to meet." "Yes," Marcus replied. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior in your establishment earlier this week. It was unacceptable." Elena nodded. "I saw the video. Not exactly the kind of publicity any of us want." "No," Marcus agreed. "But that's not why I'm here. I'd like to set up an account for homeless veterans to get coffee and food when they need it, particularly in bad weather." Elena looked surprised. "That's generous." "It's the least I can do," Marcus said. "Would that be possible?" "Of course," she replied. "We already do something similar on a small scale. But with funding, we could do much more." They discussed the details, and Marcus wrote a check that made Elena's eyes widen. As they shook hands, Marcus had one more question. "The man I confronted, James, do you know anything about him?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "Not much. He's always polite, clean despite his circumstances. Sometimes he helps other homeless folks, shows them where to get services, that sort of thing." She paused. "Actually, there was one odd thing. A few months ago, my delivery guy saw him getting into a government car with some official-looking people. When I asked James about it later, he just smiled and said he was consulting. I figured he was joking." Marcus thanked her and left, his EDZU. Mind turning over this new information? A government car. Consulting. The pieces were adding up, but the picture they formed still didn't make sense. Back at his office, Marcus found Angela waiting with an update on the military contract. Colonel Johnson's office called. They've completed the preliminary security checks and want to move forward. They're sending over the initial paperwork tomorrow. "Good," Marcus nodded, though the contract now seemed secondary to his investigation. "Also," Angela added, "someone named Ruth called. She wouldn't leave a message, just said to tell you that he'll be at the usual spot tomorrow morning." Marcus felt a surge of anticipation. James would be back at his spot outside the building tomorrow. Finally, a chance to get some answers. That night, as Marcus drove home, he took a detour past the Veterans Center. The lights were still on, and through the window he could see Ruth helping an elderly veteran with paperwork. The sign on the door said they operated entirely on donations. For a man who had built his life around the accumulation of wealth and power, the simple dedication of people like Ruth was humbling in a way Marcus had never experienced before. Tomorrow, he would finally get answers from James. But already, Marcus was beginning to understand that the real answers he sought weren't just about one homeless veteran, but about the kind of person Marcus himself had chosen to become. The next morning, Marcus left his penthouse earlier than usual. Rather than taking his Ferrari, he asked his driver to take him to the office. He wanted to be fully present when he spoke with James. As they approached the Stone Innovations building, Marcus scanned the sidewalk for James's familiar figure. But the spot where James usually sat was empty. Marcus frowned and checked his watch. Perhaps he was too early. "Circle the block," Marcus instructed his driver. Slowly, they drove around but saw no sign of James. After the third time around, Marcus gave up and had the driver drop him at the building entrance. "Mr. Stone," the security guard greeted him. "There was some excitement outside about 20 minutes ago. An ambulance came for one of the homeless guys." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Which one?" "The older guy." "The veteran who sits right over there." The guard pointed to James's usual spot. Without another word, Marcus rushed back outside and flagged down a taxi. "County Hospital." "Emergency room," he ordered, his heart racing. The taxi crawled through morning traffic. Marcus scrolled through news sites on his phone, searching for any mention of an incident near his building. Nothing yet. He called Angela to tell her he'd be late and to reschedule his morning meetings. At the hospital, Marcus strode through the emergency room entrance. The waiting area was crowded with people in various states of distress. The antiseptic smell and harsh lighting made the scene even more depressing. "I'm looking for a man who was brought in by ambulance this morning," Marcus told the receptionist. "His name is James Washington. He's a veteran, possibly homeless." The woman typed on her computer. "Are you family?" "No, I'm a friend," Marcus said, realizing how strange that must sound. "I can only release information to family members," she replied, not looking up. Marcus leaned closer. "Please, I just need to know if he's okay." She glanced up, recognition flashing in her eyes. "You're Marcus Stone." "Yes," he confirmed, preparing for either recognition of his success or hostility from the viral video. "My brother works for you. Engineering department." She hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "The patient you're asking about is being treated for pneumonia and dehydration. That's all I can tell you." "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "Can I wait here, in case he needs anything?" She nodded toward the waiting area. "It might be a while." Marcus found a seat and settled in for a long wait. The plastic chair was uncomfortable, nothing like the ergonomic office furniture he was used to. Around him, people coughed and children cried. A television mounted on the wall played daytime talk shows that no one watched. An hour passed. Marcus answered urgent emails on his phone and rescheduled a board meeting. 2 hours. He bought terrible coffee from a vending machine. 3 hours. "Mr. Stone?" Marcus looked up to see an older woman standing before him. It took him a moment to recognize Ruth from the Veterans Center. "Ruth," he said, standing quickly. "Are you here for James, too?" She nodded, studying him with curious eyes. "The center got a call from another veteran who saw the ambulance. I came as soon as I could." She paused. "I'm surprised to find you here. I wanted to make sure he was all right," Marcus said simply. Ruth seemed to consider this, then sat in the chair next to him. "They told me he's stable but weak. Pneumonia, probably from being out in that rain we had." "Do you know why he's living like that?" Marcus asked carefully. "I've learned a bit about his background. It doesn't make sense." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "James has his reasons. It's not my story to tell. But he consults for the military. He clearly has skills, connections. Life is complicated." "Mr. Stone," Ruth replied, "not everything fits into neat categories of success and failure." They sat in silence for a while. Marcus noticed Ruth's worn shoes and the careful way she had mended her sweater. Like James, she carried herself with dignity despite limited means. "How long have you known James?" Marcus asked. "About 3 years," she answered. "He started coming to the center right after Sarah died." "His wife," Marcus nodded. "I read about that. Cancer, right?" Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been doing your homework." "I'm trying to understand." A nurse appeared in the waiting room. "Family of James Washington?" Both Marcus and Ruth stood. The nurse looked between them. "I'm just a friend," Marcus said quickly. "She should go." Ruth gave him an approving look before following the nurse through a set of double doors. Left alone again, Marcus found himself thinking about what would happen if he were the one in a hospital bed. Who would come running? His assistant, probably. Business associates hoping he wouldn't die before signing important contracts. But friends? Real friends? The list was disturbingly short. Another hour passed before Ruth returned. "He's awake," she said, "and asking for you, surprisingly." Marcus felt a jolt of unexpected emotion. "He asked for me by name?" "Yes." Though I should warn you, he's weak and on medication. Don't tire him out. Marcus followed Ruth through the emergency department to a curtained area where James lay on a hospital bed. An IV ran into his arm, and a nasal cannula provided oxygen. Despite the medical equipment, James seemed more at peace than Marcus had ever seen him. "Mr. Stone," James said, his voice raspy. "Ruth says you've been waiting." "I heard what happened," Marcus replied, feeling suddenly awkward. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "Pneumonia," James said with a weak smile. "Not my first bout. Won't be my last." Ruth touched James's shoulder. "I'll get you some water. Don't talk too much." After she left, an uncomfortable silence filled the space. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Thank you," James said finally. "For what?" "Waiting. Most people wouldn't bother." Marcus looked down. "Most people didn't publicly humiliate you either." James chuckled, then winced. "True. Why did you ask to see me?" Marcus asked. "Ruth said you've been asking questions. About me. About why I'm on the streets." James's eyes, though tired, were sharp and assessing. "You're confused." "Yes," Marcus admitted. "None of it makes sense. You work with the Defense Department. You have skills, education, experience. Why would you be homeless?" James closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at Marcus with an expression that seemed to contain both amusement and sadness. "Not everyone who appears homeless is what they seem, Mr. Stone." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, Ruth returned with water and a doctor in tow. "That's enough visiting for now," the doctor said firmly. "Mr. Washington needs rest." "Of course," Marcus nodded, stepping back. "I'll come back tomorrow if that's all right." James gave a small nod before closing his eyes. In the hallway, Ruth touched Marcus's arm. "He'll be here for a few days at least. They're moving him to a regular room soon." "Will he be okay?" Marcus asked. "James is tougher than he looks," Ruth assured him, "but he needs proper care. Warm clothes, good food." "I'll take care of the hospital bill," Marcus said immediately, "and anything else he needs." Ruth studied him again with that same curious expression. "Why?" Marcus wasn't sure how to answer. A week ago, the question would never have arisen. He wouldn't have been standing in a public hospital, worried about a man he'd previously ignored or disdained. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. "About him. About a lot of things." Ruth's expression softened. "He'll be in room 412 once they move him. Visiting hours start at 10 tomorrow." As Marcus left the hospital, his phone buzzed with notifications he'd been ignoring. 15 missed calls, 30 new emails. The business world continued its frantic pace without him. For the first time in his career, Marcus found himself not caring about any of it. Something more important had captured his attention. A mystery, yes, but also a chance to understand a world he'd spent his life avoiding. In his car, Marcus looked back at the hospital building. Inside was a man who seemed to live in two worlds simultaneously: the respected military consultant and the homeless veteran. How was that possible? And what had James meant about people not being what they seemed? Tomorrow, Marcus would return with more questions, but also with supplies, clothes, and whatever else James might need. It was a small thing, perhaps too little too late, but it was a start. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital carrying several shopping bags. Before coming, he'd stopped at an upscale department store and bought warm clothes, comfortable pajamas, toiletries, and even a pair of quality boots. He'd guessed at James's size, but the saleswoman had been helpful once Marcus explained the situation. At the nurse's station, Marcus introduced himself and explained he was visiting James Washington. Room 4-12, the nurse confirmed. He's doing better this morning. The doctor just finished rounds. Marcus knocked softly on the door before entering. James was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than yesterday. The oxygen tube was gone, though the IV remained. "Good morning," Marcus said, feeling strangely nervous. "I brought some things. I thought they might be useful." James looked at the shopping bags with surprise. "You didn't need to do that." "I wanted to," Marcus replied, setting the bags on a chair. "Nothing fancy, just some warm clothes, pajamas, that sort of thing." "Thank you," James said simply. An awkward silence followed. They were two men from different worlds, connected by chance and circumstance, with no natural common ground. "The doctor says your pneumonia is responding to the antibiotics," Marcus said finally. James nodded. "Not my first time. My lungs haven't been the same since Afghanistan." Marcus sat in the visitor's chair. "I'd like to understand, James, about your situation." James studied him, his eyes thoughtful. "Why does it matter to you?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Why did it matter? A week ago, it wouldn't have. A week ago, James would have been just another homeless person to ignore. "Because everything I thought I knew about how the world works doesn't explain you," Marcus said honestly. "You're a decorated officer, a skilled professional. You're still working with the Defense Department, but you're living on the streets. It doesn't make sense." James was quiet for a long moment. "Life doesn't always make sense, Mr. Stone. Please call me Marcus." "Marcus," James acknowledged. "What do you know about my background?" "I know you served 25 years, multiple combat tours, cybersecurity expert, Silver Star and Purple Heart recipient. Then you retired 3 years ago, worked briefly for a defense contractor, and then nothing. Until I saw you outside my building." James smiled slightly. "You've been investigating me." "I was curious," Marcus admitted. "And I know your wife Sarah died 2 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry for your loss." A shadow passed over James's face. "Thank you. Was it? Is that why?" Marcus struggled to find a delicate way to ask if his wife's death had led to homelessness. "Is that why I'm on the streets?" James finished for him. "It's part of the story." He sighed, looking older suddenly. "Sarah's cancer was rare. The standard treatments didn't work. There was an experimental program that showed promise, but our insurance wouldn't cover it. So you paid out of pocket," Marcus guessed. James nodded. "Everything we had. Savings, retirement, home equity. When that ran out, I took loans. When she died..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I had nothing left but debts. But your military pension, your skills..." "My pension goes directly to the medical creditors," James explained. "Will for another 5 years. As for my skills," he shrugged. "The consulting work with the DoD is sporadic. They call when they need me." Marcus tried to imagine losing everything. That way, watching someone you love die while also losing your financial security. "I still don't understand why you're homeless," Marcus said. "Even with financial problems, someone with your background could find steady work, a place to live." Something flickered in James's eyes, caution perhaps. "After Sarah died, I didn't much care about anything," he said carefully. "And then I discovered something on the streets that gave me purpose again." "What was that?" James looked away. "Other veterans who needed help. Men and women who served but fell through the cracks. I could do more for them from their side of things than from an office somewhere." Marcus wasn't sure he fully believed this explanation. It seemed like James was holding something back. "The day we met at the coffee shop," Marcus began, "that same day, you came to my office as a consultant. How does that work? Do you just change clothes and become someone else?" A small smile touched James's lips. "Something like that." Before Marcus could press further, Ruth arrived with a small flower arrangement. "How's our patient today?" she asked cheerfully, though her eyes moved curiously between the two men. "Much better," James answered. Marcus brought some supplies. Ruth raised her eyebrows at the shopping bags. That was thoughtful. Over the next few days, Marcus visited James regularly. Each time, he brought something: books, better hospital food, a new phone to replace James's basic model. Gradually, their conversations became easier, less guarded on both sides. James shared stories from his military days, carefully edited, Marcus suspected, to remove classified information. He spoke of Afghanistan's rugged beauty and the camaraderie among soldiers. He described cybersecurity operations in terms Marcus could understand, showing a gift for explaining complex technical concepts. In turn, Marcus talked about building his company, the challenges and triumphs along the way. He found himself admitting things he'd never told anyone: the loneliness of leadership, the emptiness of success without meaningful connections. "Do you have family?" James asked on the third day. Marcus shook his head. "My parents died years ago. No siblings, no wife, no kids." "No one should be that alone," James said quietly. "I have employees, business associates," Marcus replied, hearing how hollow it sounded. "That's not the same as family or friends." On the fourth day, as James prepared for discharge, Marcus finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "James, do you remember anything my father used to say? Most people are just 2 or 3 bad months away from disaster." James nodded. "That's true for more people than you'd think. But there's something more to your story, isn't there?" Marcus pressed. "Something you're not telling me." James became very still. "Why do you say that?" "Little things. The way Colonel Johnson defers to you. How you have access to classified military information. The government car that picked you up once. It's like you're living a double life." For a long moment, James said nothing. Then he sighed deeply. "Marcus, I appreciate everything you've done. The clothes, the phone, paying my hospital bill. But, more importantly, taking the time to listen, to care. That means something. It shows you're not the man from the coffee shop. Not really." "But you're avoiding my question," Marcus pointed out. James smiled slightly. "Yes, I am." "Why?" "Because some things are complicated, and some things are classified." James held Marcus's gaze. "Can you accept that there might be more to my story that I can't share? At least not yet?" Marcus wanted to press further, but realized he had no right to demand answers. James had shared what he was willing to share. "I'd like to help you," Marcus said instead. "When you leave here, you don't have to go back to the streets. I have plenty of room in my penthouse, or I could set you up in an apartment." James shook his head. "Thank you, but no. I need to get back to my life." "Living on the sidewalk, outside my building?" "For now, yes," James said firmly. "I have responsibilities there that you don't understand." Marcus felt frustrated but tried not to show it. "At least, take my card. Call me if you need anything at all." As Marcus prepared to leave, he felt that despite all their conversations, James Washington remained a puzzle with key pieces missing. The homeless veteran and the respected military consultant, two versions of the same man, somehow existing side by side. What James couldn't know was that Marcus had no intention of letting the mystery rest. Too much had changed inside him. The man who had once walked past homeless people without seeing them could no longer look away. And as Marcus stepped out of the hospital room, he made a silent promise to himself. He would discover the truth about James Washington, not out of mere curiosity, but because he genuinely cared what happened to this complicated man who had, through chance and circumstance, completely changed Marcus's view of the world. 2 days after James was discharged from the hospital, Marcus spotted him back in his usual spot outside the Stone Innovations building. Despite the new clothes Marcus had given him, James still wore his old military jacket. He nodded politely as Marcus approached, as if their lengthy hospital conversations had never happened. "You're looking better," Marcus said, stopping in front of him. "Fresh air does wonders," James replied with a small smile. Marcus glanced around at the busy sidewalk, the rushing people, the exhaust from passing buses. "Yes, very fresh." "Did you need something, Mr. Stone?" James asked, his tone more formal than it had been in the hospital. The change in address stung Marcus more than he expected. "I thought we were past Mr. Stone," he said quietly. James glanced around. Different context here. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding. On the street, they were back to their public roles, the wealthy CEO and the homeless veteran. The friendship that had begun to form in the hospital seemed suddenly distant. "Can we talk somewhere else?" Marcus asked. "My office, maybe? Or lunch?" James seemed to consider this, then shook his head. "Not today. But thank you." Frustrated, but trying not to show it, Marcus nodded again. "The offer stands. Anytime." That evening, Marcus received a call from Colonel Johnson. The military contract was moving forward. Final paperwork would be ready for signatures within the week. It was everything Marcus had hoped for professionally, but somehow it felt hollow, compared to the question of James Washington's true situation. 3 more days passed. Marcus saw James in his usual spot each morning, exchanged brief greetings, but nothing more. James seemed determined to maintain the distance between them, despite everything they had shared. On the 4th day, as Marcus was leaving work, he impulsively decided to take a different route. Instead of going directly to his car, he walked around the block toward where James usually sat, but James wasn't there. A different homeless man had taken the spot, an older veteran with a gray beard whom Marcus recognized from his earlier inquiries. "Excuse me," Marcus said, approaching him. "Do you know where James is?" The man looked up with rheumy eyes. "Who's asking?" "I'm a friend," Marcus said, realizing he meant it. The old veteran studied him. "You're that CEO guy from the building." "Yes," Marcus admitted. "James said you might come looking. Said to tell you he's got business elsewhere for a few days." "Did he say where?" The man shook his head. Not his style to explain himself. Marcus thanked him and slipped him some money before walking away. Business elsewhere. What kind of business did a homeless man have? Unless, of course, that business involved his other identity. The lieutenant colonel consulting for the Defense Department. A sudden impulse struck Marcus. He pulled out his phone and called Colonel Johnson. "Mr. Stone," she answered formally. "I was just about to call you. We've set up the final contract meeting for Friday at 10 a.m. "That's fine," Marcus said. "But I'm actually calling about something else. Lieutenant Colonel Washington. Is he working with you this week on another project?" There was a pause on the line. "May I ask why you're inquiring about personnel assignments?" "It's personal," Marcus replied. "James and I have become friends, I suppose. He's helped me see some things differently." Another pause, longer this time. I see, Colonel Johnson said finally. In that case, yes, he's involved in a special operation this week. I can't discuss details. I understand, Marcus said. Thank you. After hanging up, Marcus felt both validated and more confused. His theory was correct. James was indeed living some kind of double life. But why maintain the homeless facade? What possible purpose could it serve? The next day passed without any sign of James. Marcus found himself distracted during meetings, constantly checking his phone for messages that never came. On Friday morning, Marcus arrived early for the contract meeting. He hoped James might be there with Colonel Johnson, but when he entered the conference room, only the colonel and 2 military attorneys were present. Lieutenant Colonel Washington sends his regrets, Colonel Johnson said, seeming to read Marcus's thoughts. He's still tied up with the other matter. The meeting proceeded smoothly. By noon, Marcus had signed a $500 million contract that would transform his company's future. Yet as he shook hands with Colonel Johnson, the only question on his mind was about James. When you see him, Marcus said quietly, please tell him I'd like to speak with him. It's important. Colonel Johnson studied him with sharp eyes. You really have become friends, haven't you? Is that so surprising, given how you met? Yes, a bit, she replied with unexpected candor. Marcus felt himself flush with shame, remembering the coffee shop incident. People can change, Colonel. So they can, she agreed. I'll pass along your message. 3 more days passed with no word from James. Marcus drove past the Veterans Center twice, but Ruth said she hadn't seen him either. His usual spot remained occupied by the gray-bearded veteran who had no new information to share. On the 4th day, as Marcus was about to leave his office, Angela buzzed him. Sir, there's a James Washington here to see you. No appointment. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. Send him in immediately. When James walked in, Marcus was struck by the transformation. Gone was any trace of the homeless man. James wore a crisp button-down shirt, khaki pants, and polished shoes. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair freshly cut. He looked exactly like what he was, a retired military officer. James, Marcus said, rising from behind his desk. I've been looking for you. So I hear, James replied with a small smile. Colonel Johnson mentioned it several times. Marcus gestured to a chair. Please, sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you, James said, taking the offered seat. I understand congratulations are in order. The contract was finalized. Yes, Marcus nodded, sitting across from him. Though that seems less important right now, James raised an eyebrow. $500 million seems pretty important. Not compared to the truth, Marcus replied, which is what I hope you're here to share. James was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus as if making a decision. Finally, he sighed. You're right. You deserve the truth. But first, I need your word that what I tell you stays confidential. You have it, Marcus promised. James leaned forward slightly. Marcus, I'm not actually homeless. Despite having suspected this, hearing it stated plainly was still shocking. But I've seen you for months outside my building. Yes, James nodded. That's my cover. Cover for what? After I retired from military intelligence, I was recruited for a special program, James explained. We place veterans as undercover observers in urban centers to monitor for potential security threats. Marcus blinked, trying to process this. You're a spy? On American streets? Not exactly. We don't spy on American citizens, James clarified. We observe and report suspicious activities that might indicate terrorist threats, foreign intelligence operations, or other security concerns. And pretending to be homeless helps with this how. People become invisible when they're homeless, James said simply. Most people look right through them, past them. It's the perfect cover for surveillance. Who notices when a homeless person sits in the same spot for hours? Who questions when they move around the city at odd hours? Marcus felt a chill as he realized the truth of this. He himself had walked past James hundreds of times without truly seeing him. My position outside your building wasn't random, James continued. Stone Innovations houses sensitive technology, and several foreign companies in your building have been under investigation for industrial espionage. So you were watching my building? Not me personally? James nodded. Initially, yes. But then the Defense Department became interested in your security chips. Colonel Johnson knew I was already in position near your company, so she brought me in as a consultant for the contract. And the coffee shop? Marcus asked, remembering their first real encounter with shame. Bad timing, James said with a wry smile. I was just trying to get out of the rain. I never expected to run into you there, or to have coffee spilled on you. I behaved terribly, Marcus said quietly. Yes, you did, James agreed without rancor. But you've more than made up for it since then. Marcus shook his head, still processing everything. But what about your wife? The medical debts? Was that part of your cover story too? Pain flashed across James's face. No. Sarah's death was real. The cancer, the treatments, the debts, all of it happened just as I told you. That part wasn't a cover. I'm sorry, Marcus said, feeling like the words were inadequate. Thank you, James replied. After she died, I was in a dark place. The program gave me purpose again, a way to keep serving. And the times I saw you helping other homeless veterans? Was that part of your cover too? No, James said firmly. That was real. Many of those men and women really did serve. They deserve better than they've gotten. When I can help them while maintaining my cover, I do. Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking it all in. So all. Those months I walked past you, you were actually working, observing, protecting. Yes, and I never even noticed you. None of us did. That's the point, James said. The best surveillance is the kind no one sees. Marcus thought about all the invisible people he passed every day. The security guards, janitors, service workers, homeless individuals. How many of them saw and understood more than anyone realized? Why are you telling me this now? Marcus asked. Isn't this classified information? It is, James confirmed. But I've received permission to bring you partially into the loop. Your security clearance for the military contract makes it possible. And he hesitated. I wanted you to know the truth. You've changed, Marcus. I've watched it happen. Because of you, Marcus said. James shook his head. No. The capacity for change was always in you. You just needed something to wake it up. They talked for another hour. James explained more about the program, how it operated, how many veterans were involved. He shared stories of cases they'd helped prevent, terrorist plots identified, foreign agents discovered, lives saved. Throughout it all, Marcus listened with growing amazement. What happens now? Marcus asked finally. Will you continue your surveillance outside my building? No, James replied. My cover there is compromised, not just because of you, but the coffee shop video didn't help. He smiled wryly. I'm being reassigned. Where? I can't say. That's still classified. Marcus nodded, understanding but disappointed. Will I see you again? Occasionally, James said. I'll still consult on the military contract. And perhaps we can get coffee sometime, properly, without spilling it on each other. As their meeting concluded and James prepared to leave, Marcus had one last question. The homelessness statistics, the veterans struggling with PTSD and transition, all that is still real, isn't it? Even if you're not actually homeless yourself. Very real, James confirmed soberly. Thousands of veterans sleep on the streets every night. My situation is the exception, not the rule. Then the foundation I'm setting up to help homeless veterans, that work is still important. More important than you know, James said, his eyes reflecting genuine appreciation. It's one thing to protect the country from external threats. It's another to make sure it's worth protecting, that we take care of our own. As they shook hands at the door, Marcus felt a sense of both closure and new beginning. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Just remember what you've learned, James replied, about looking past the surface, about seeing people who think they're invisible. After James left, Marcus stood at his office window, looking down at the city streets below. From 30 floors up, the people looked tiny, just as they had that morning weeks ago when this all began. But now, Marcus saw them differently. Not as ants scurrying about their insignificant lives, but as individuals with stories, struggles, and dignity. Some, like James, might even be heroes hiding in plain sight. He thought about the man who had taken James's spot outside the building. Was he truly homeless, or another undercover observer? Did it matter? Either way, he deserved to be seen, acknowledged, respected. Marcus Stone, the man who once had everything, now realized how little he had truly understood about the world. And as he turned back to his desk, to the military contract that would make him even wealthier, he knew that his greatest gain had nothing to do with money. It was the ability to finally see beyond the masks we all wear, to recognize the humanity in every person, and to understand that the true measure of a man isn't what he possesses, but who he chooses to become. Thanks for joining me for this story of unexpected connection and revelation. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know in the comments. If this tale of Marcus and James touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Your simple click helps spread messages of kindness, compassion, and looking beyond appearances to see the real person inside. And if you enjoyed this story, don't miss the video appearing on your screen right now for another powerful journey of transformation. Click it to continue exploring stories that remind us there's always more to people than meets the eye. Until next time, remember that a small act of kindness can change someone's life, and sometimes that someone might be you.